want to talk about 3 approaches when you are serving as an advisor for another person. Now, this could be you working inside the same company with that person and you're a mentor for that person, or you're providing advice to that person, or it could be that you work outside of the company and you happen to be working with somebody as an advisor. You can use these 3 approaches in either situation. The first approach is the environment that you create with the other individual. It's really important that the person feels that he or she can trust you and that you will keep things confidential between the 2 of you. It's also important in this environment that the person feels that you really are interested in what they're saying, that you are listening in an attentive way, and that you care about the other person's success. It's also important that the person feels that you respect him or her enough that you're not going to try to solve their problem, but that you believe that the other person is capable of coming up with a solution. So all these pieces in the environment are really important. You might listen to what the person says and then say, here's what I think you're saying, and then summarize what you've heard, and the other person can respond to it. And then you might say something like, well, what do you think you could do? And you're allowing the other person to come up with the solution. Now, a great book on this topic, this method, is really a classic book called On Becoming a Person by Carl Rogers. This whole book is basically about this approach of creating an environment where the other person feels trusted, that you're paying attention, that you care about the other person's success, and that you're not going to try to tell them what to do in this situation. The second approach for being an advisor to the other person is to realize when they are stuck in a negative emotion. A negative emotion could be anger, fear, bitterness, shame, hopelessness, or pessimism. When you're working with somebody as an advisor and you think that they're stuck in a negative emotion and they're talking about it over and over again, then as the advisor, it's very important that you work with the other person to identify what is the thought that is producing the negative emotion. The negative emotion did not just come out of thin air. It came from somewhere, and it came from a thought that the person has. So work with the person to identify what thought is producing the negative emotion, and then work with the person to identify how they could challenge that thought to change it to a thought that produces a more positive emotion. Here's a simple example. If the person says, I am really afraid I'm going to lose my job, you might say to the person, well, why are you afraid? What is the thought that's producing the feeling that you're afraid you're going to lose your job? And the person might say, well, in the last 3 years, 3 different people have been fired in our organization. And then you could ask, well, what did they get fired for? And if the person says something like, well, there was a guy who got really, really bad results, way below what we thought we were going to get, and he got let go. And there was a woman who worked here who got good results, but she was blatantly rude to people. And eventually they just got tired of it and they let her go. And then there was another guy, I remember, who got fired because he was cheating on his expense report. And they just said, you know, we can't accept that, and they let him go. And then you could say to the person, well, how is your performance? How are your results? And if the person says, my results are pretty strong, and then you could say, well, do you have any behavior issues? Is there anything that's going against company values? And if the person says, no, my behaviors are fine, then you could say, well, do you cheat? Do you steal from the company? And if the person says, no, of course I don't, well, then you could say, well, then what is it you're really afraid about? It looks to me as though there's no reason to be afraid that you're going to lose your job. And then you could encourage the person, when something bad happens, to diminish it. Say, well, that was a one-time thing that happened. I don't need to be afraid of that. And when something good happens, expand it. Say, well, that's the way things generally go. People generally give me a lot of positive feedback. And you can begin to help them shift away from the thought that's producing the negative emotion to a thought that produces more of a positive emotion. A great book on this topic, really one of the classics on this topic, is called A Guide to Rational Living. And in this book, Albert Ellis and Robert Harper take you through a whole bunch of examples on how to identify the thought that's producing a negative emotion, and then realize that it's usually irrational, and then it can be taken on and changed, and then it can lead into a much, much more positive emotion, a healthier emotion. One more tip, one more suggestion on how to be an advisor for another person. When you notice that the other person is stuck in kind of a status quo trap, where they say things like, well, I've been doing this for 5 years and it worked great 5 years ago and it's working pretty darn well now, I don't see any reason to change. They might be falling into a trap where they're actually going to fall behind. So what I encourage you to do is to challenge them, to say something like, well, what would make you even more effective? I know that that's effective right now, but what I'm asking you is, what would make you even more effective? And challenge their growth. Now, a really good book, I thought it was a tremendous book, is by a guy named Robert Johnson, who was a very famous psychologist, sold over 2.5 million copies of his books. But this book right here, called Balancing Heaven and Earth, is his autobiography. And there was a quote on page 169, but I want to share it with you. He said, the counselor should fight for that part of the personality that wants to heal and grow. Be prepared to battle for the other person's growth. A lot of times what happens is the other person, it feels totally comfortable and okay with where they're at, but clearly they could grow, they could become more effective. And that's the part where the advisor sometimes has to be willing to battle, to challenge the other person. So just to review, three key methods to being an effective advisor. The first one is to create an environment where the person can trust you and they feel that you are really listening, you're attentive, and you care about their success, and you respect them enough to not try to solve their problems for them. Second key, when they're stuck in a negative emotion, work with them to challenge the thought that's producing the emotion in order to change the thought to create a more positive emotion. And the third approach is when you notice that they're stuck in a status quo approach, status quo mindset, challenge them to see if they can't find a way to become more effective. Take care and have a great day.